In this video, we're going to get started with creating our high scores list. Actually, this will finish the high scores list as well. Um, the only thing the high scores list really is just it's just the ability to read from the config file every game that's been considered to be game over, and then sort the array basically from top to bottom so that we can see the highest scores on top and the lower scores in the bottom. To get started, we're going to go inside of our PuzGFX main menu movie, like everything else takes place in, and we're going to create a certain number of variables. But first, down at the bottom, we're going to set movie info to swf puz main menu 3 and puz main menu 3. So puz main menu 3 dot puz main menu 3. And now we can continue on with our code, because now we'll be able to grab the new movie clips and functionality that exists inside of our new movie, so that we can add these high scores. Alright, so to get started, we begin with this is going to be kind of very similar to our save game usage, the way we did that. So what we're going to have is we're going to have a constant called max high scores, because we're only going to show 10 high scores, top 10. We're going to have variable GFX object, high scores screen, and high scores list. So at this point, you should kind of have an idea that this is just going to hold the screen that holds the high scores, and also this is going to have the list as well. And then we have variable GFX object high score, which is each individual score on the scores list. We have a GFX object high score text field, which is the text field inside of each of the high scores. And then we have variable bool b high score initiated, which basically is before, did we actually initiate this yet? And if we did, we don't want to do it again. And finally, we have variable array of puz high scores. This is a dynamic array, because when we grab the whole list, we want to be able to not limit it, because we're not limiting this just to 10 scores. We want to pull everything. So if the person's played 100 games and 75 of them involve game overs, then we want to make sure we grab all 75. If we were to make this limited to 10, it would just grab the first 10 in the list, and that wouldn't do very much, because most of the time when you're making a high scores list, you're going to need to see every score that's ever been done. So now that we have our variables, we go down to initialize, and we do the same thing here. We do high scores screen equals root screen dot get object high scores background, and because the high scores list is actually inside of the high scores screen, we do high scores screen dot get object high scores list. So we're kind of in the third layer now. The root's the main layer, and then we go down into our second layer, which is high scores screen, which is a movie clip. We go down into our third layer, which is high scores list, which is a movie clip. And we're even going to go lower than that, because we're going to go to a fourth layer, which is the buttons, or the high score themselves. Then we go down to our on high score button pressed. And what this is going to do is when the person clicks on the high score button, we need to load it. So we start off by creating a couple of locals here. We have an integer I and a score string, which the score string is basically a lot like our onload button for the buttons string. It's going to basically hold the list of scores for the button name. It's really for the names, not really for the scores themselves. Local array integer high score number. This is going to be the actual array that temporarily holds the numbers so that we can sort them. And then we have local integer c, which is, we're going to set c to 0, because while we're doing a for loop, we're going to want to change a certain aspect of the array without changing other aspects of a different array, all inside of one for loop. So we're going to have two separate counters, basically. And then the first thing we do is we call in a function called create high scores array. So we're going to go down to that real quick. Creates a high scores array. And what create high scores array does is it fills our dynamic array that we just talked about at the top of the screen, the variable we created. And it fills it fully. So unlike before where we just stopped at 5, we're going to fill up the whole thing. And if you look, that this function is going to look a lot like our create save config game function. It's almost identical in many ways, except for one spot when we get to where we're separating the arrays out. So what we have here is we do our get per object config sections, which means we read the section list. We then separate the section list from the actual instance of each section list, and then we set that instance name to that high score so that we can in the dynamic array, so that we can grab from that information. Okay, so once we do that, we go back up to the top here, and we then want to set our high score number. So we need to grab from one dynamic array. We need to grab from another dynamic array. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a for loop where I equals 0 while I is less than pus high scores dot length, so the length of the entire dynamic array, and we're going to add I plus plus for every time we go through it. And then we're going to say if pus high scores I dot save game ID num is less than or equal to -1. So if the ID num has been set to -1, which they do get set to if the game's over, or lower. So for some reason, if we have another reason why we want to set a lower number, uh, then we're going to grab that information and put it into the high scores number array, which is an integer array. And so we're going to set high scores number C is equal to pus high scores I dot player points, and then we're going to add 1 to the array. So that we're increasing this array um, only if we have another game over to add to it. If we put I here, it would just constantly it would make the array out of sync. You might have high scores num 0, and then you might have nothing in high scores num 1 and 2, and then you get to high scores number 3, and there might be something, and then you don't want to do that. You want to keep the array full and complete as it moves its way up. Next, we're going to say if the high score number dot length is greater than or equal to 2. So if there's at least 2 high scores, at least 2 game overs at this point, then we want to sort that. And the dot sort function is something that's part of the dynamic array that UDK offers. And what that's going to do is it's going to sort through our array here. It's going to pass this array in, and it's going to sort through it and put, depending on how we set it up, it's going to put, it's going to swap basically the arrays around for us. So let's go down to set highest. And here we are. We have a delegate integer set highest. And we have integer A and integer B, so those are the 2 moments in the array. So it could be array moment 1, array moment 2, array moment 2, array moment 3, so on and so forth. It could be array moment 1 against array moment 4, whatever. And we're just going to say if integer A is less than B, swap them. So we're going to return if A is less than B. The question mark basically is kind of like true or false. And then we say if it's true, we set that to -1. Otherwise, if it's false, we set to 0. And the way this delegate works is -1, because the way UDK set it up was the way this delegate would work was -1 means swap them, 0 means don't swap them. That's how it works. So you could have a whole bunch of code in here, and in the end, if you return -1, that means swap the 2 arrays, and if you return 0, that means don't swap the arrays. So in our case, ours is a simple swap because we're just checking to see if one integer is lower than the other. And if one is lower, then we want to switch their positions. Okay, so we go back up to the top here, and we have if B high score is initiated, just like before. We just want to make sure it wasn't initiated already. And then we're going to do our for loop where we have our max high scores. We're going to set each of those 10 buttons, just like before we did kind of like with our load game ability. And then we're going to say if I is less than high scores number dot length, so it's less than the array, and I is less than max high scores. So in other words, if the length is 5, we're going to stop. We're not going to keep going because there's no reason to keep going. There's no more high scores. Or if for some reason we go above max high scores at that point, but we're still below the length, we want to stop also because we're not going to go past 10. So it kind of serves both purposes here. And then we're going to set the text field to set string high score number and then that high score. So it's going to list it in the order that we want. And then we're going to set B high scores initiated to equal true. So it only initializes once. And now at this point, your game will load when you start it up. And if you do have any game overs, anything that has the score or the ID num set to -1 or lower, at this point it's going to consider that a high score game, and it'll check to see if it is in fact one of the top 10 high scores. And if it is in fact the top 10 high score, it will show it on the high scores list. And that completes this video.